Invisible Lives Taken Down, an ethnographic book on abuse, vulnerability, and recovery. My name is Henning Enrique Garcia Torrance. I am a biologist, a doctor in medical anthropology, a university professor, and a survivor researcher. And for years I have been investigating a reality that remains profoundly under-recognized despite recurring across very different societies. The way human suffering becomes transformed into an individual psychiatric problem while the violence, deprivation, relationships, institutions, and histories producing that suffering disappear from view. I am crowdfunding the continuation of this work through Invisible Lives Taken Down, a science popularization book grounded in long-term fieldwork, scientific research, and lived experience, bringing together several bodies of knowledge that are too often kept apart: biological science, psychiatric research, anthropology, ethnopsychiatry, collective mental health, and the sociocultural study of institutions and power. The purpose is not simply to publish a personal account, nor to produce another criticism of psychiatry, but to make visible a systemic reality that affects victims, patients, families, professionals, and society as a whole, while continuing the research required to understand how these mechanisms operate and how they can be replaced. The central problem became visible repeatedly in the lives I studied. People experiencing severe distress, violence, or extreme social adversity are frequently understood through psychiatric categories that progressively displace the circumstances producing their suffering. Their histories become background information, their relationships and material conditions become secondary, and the violence surrounding them disappears from the explanation. Fear is interpreted as instability, resistance as lack of insight, the consequences of abuse as symptoms, and attempts to describe what was done to a person become further evidence for the psychiatric account already established around them. This is not simply a problem of terminology, because once an institutional interpretation becomes established, it begins to organize what happens next. A person is no longer encountered from an open starting point, but through an account already written about them: previous allegations, family statements, clinical observations, diagnoses, and institutional decisions enter the record as apparently established facts. And subsequent professionals encounter the resulting representation before they encounter the person themselves. The history constructed around that person therefore becomes part of the evidence used to interpret everything that follows. When that representation is false, each subsequent interpretation reinforces the previous one. A person frightened by violence is interpreted through the presumption of instability. Someone resisting coercion is interpreted as lacking insight. Someone contradicting the institutional account is interpreted as further demonstrating the disorder attributed to them. And someone reporting abuse finds that the report itself enters the psychiatric narrative as evidence against their credibility, until a record that began with an allegation, an unverified statement, or a distorted interpretation acquires the appearance of independent truth simply because later professionals have inherited and repeated it. The mechanism becomes particularly entrenched when the person has already been subjected to coercive or violent intervention, because the resulting fear, exhaustion, withdrawal, anger, physical impairment, or mistrust is then observed within the very framework that authorized the intervention and interpreted as further evidence that the intervention was necessary. A person harmed by coercion therefore becomes the apparent proof that coercion was justified, while the injuries and psychological consequences produced by the intervention itself disappear from the causal account. The system acts upon an interpretation, produces consequences through that intervention, observes those consequences, and then uses them to validate the interpretation that justified the intervention in the first place. This circularity becomes especially powerful once a complaint is made, because examining the complaint honestly may require the institution to examine what it itself has done. Whether a professional judgment was wrong, whether an intervention caused harm, whether safeguards failed, whether colleagues were mistaken, whether records contain unsupported claims, or whether an established narrative has been maintained without adequate evidence. The complaint therefore does not arrive in an empty evidentiary environment. It challenges an entire structure of mutually reinforcing accounts, and the complainant is not merely asking to be heard about what happened, but asking the institution to reconsider the credibility of the very framework through which it has already justified its decisions. There is therefore a structural incentive towards closure and self-protection, particularly where several professionals, relatives, and previous records already depend upon the established interpretation, because accepting the complaint as credible may reopen decisions that have already been justified, expose professional failures, implicate institutional procedures, and require an organization to acknowledge that authority was misplaced. Preserving the existing account is institutionally easier and more compatible with the established order, while the person challenging it carries the consequences of reopening everything that has already been settled around them. This does not require every professional involved to consciously decide to silence a victim, although deliberate suppression and retaliation also exist and must be investigated where evidence supports them, because institutional systems also produce silencing through ordinary processes of conformity, deference, and self-protection. A professional inherits the previous record, trusts the professional who wrote it, interprets the person's current behavior through that history, records the new interpretation, and leaves the next professional with an even more apparently coherent account. The mechanism therefore reproduces itself through ordinary professional activity while progressively making the original error harder to see. The problem becomes even more entrenched when many people have already passed through the same environment, because previous cases lend familiarity and apparent credibility to the established narrative while simultaneously normalizing the practices through which harm was produced. Professionals learn from previous records, newer professionals inherit assumptions from those who came before them. And accumulated documentation creates the impression that the institution has repeatedly encountered the same kind of problem in the same kind of person, when what may actually be repeating is the same institutional interpretation and the same mechanism of response. A pattern produced by the institution can therefore return to the institution as evidence that its interpretation was correct. The resulting asymmetry is profound, because those subjected to coercion are expected to demonstrate extraordinary consistency after being frightened, isolated, medicated, restrained, discredited, or otherwise harmed, while those whose decisions produce those circumstances retain the institutional presumption that their actions were reasonable. The victim's distress becomes evidence, their resistance becomes evidence, their changed behavior becomes evidence. Their inability to recount events perfectly becomes evidence, and even their attempt to challenge the record becomes evidence within the record, while the original decision that set the process in motion remains comparatively protected from scrutiny. The standards imposed upon the two sides are therefore radically unequal. Those being harmed are expected to behave perfectly under conditions in which their lives are being dismantled, while those exercising authority may contradict themselves, disregard evidence, misinterpret circumstances, reproduce unsupported allegations, or fail to investigate serious complaints without automatically losing the credibility attached to their position. What would be treated as evidence of unreliability when done by the victim is often absorbed, rationalized, or overlooked when done by those exercising power. The victim is ultimately left without meaningful recourse to the very system that should provide protection, often completely isolated and with no independent person or institution willing or able to stand outside the established narrative and investigate what has happened. This isolation is not merely an unfortunate consequence occurring alongside the process, because coercive interventions discrediting damaged relationships and the progressive erosion of credibility can themselves remove the sources of support through which a person might otherwise seek protection, leaving the person increasingly dependent upon the same institutional and social structures that are failing them. Family relationships may have been destroyed or captured by the established account. Friends and colleagues may withdraw because they have been told that the person is unstable or unreliable. Professionals may defer to previous records, and other institutions may treat those records as authoritative. So at each stage, the person's capacity to obtain an independent hearing is further diminished. The person may therefore have nowhere left to turn, not because no formal complaint mechanism exists on paper, but because every realistic route back into protection has already been compromised. They complain to the institution responsible for their treatment and encounter the institution's own account. They seek help from relatives who may be involved in the abuse or have accepted the established narrative. They approach another professional who receives the same records and therefore begins from the same assumptions. And they attempt to defend themselves while already carrying the physical, psychological, social, and economic consequences of what has happened. Even when the complaint is coherent and serious, the complainant may therefore be assessed through the accumulated history produced by the very system being challenged. This is where the mechanism becomes profoundly isolating, because the interventions intended to protect the person may simultaneously dismantle their ability to seek protection elsewhere. Coercion produces fear and mistrust. Institutional discrediting undermines credibility. Isolation removes relationships. Treatment effects may reduce physical and cognitive capacity. And the resulting deterioration is then incorporated into the narrative as further evidence that the person is incapable of managing their own life. The person becomes progressively less able to resist at precisely the moment when resistance is most necessary, while the surrounding institutions become progressively more confident that their own interpretation has been confirmed. In the most extreme cases, there is simply no one left outside the machinery who will listen independently, and this is one of the most devastating consequences of the process, because the person is not merely denied a favorable decision but deprived of the social and institutional conditions required to make any meaningful appeal at all. They are isolated, discredited, materially weakened, and increasingly dependent upon those who have already defined what happened to them, while every attempt to challenge that definition is absorbed into the same narrative. What appears from outside as a functioning system of assessment and protection can therefore become, from inside the life of the person subjected to it, a closed circuit from which there is no credible route of escape. This is how an institution can end up defending not merely an individual decision but its own accumulated history, because once people, records, and professional judgments have been organized around the same interpretation, challenging one case threatens the coherence of the wider system. The person who complains therefore encounters something much larger than the individual professional who may have harmed them. They encounter a network of previous decisions, inherited assumptions, professional relationships, and institutional interests that has already incorporated the established narrative into its own functioning, while the consequences of coercion and abuse continue to provide the very material through which that narrative is maintained. The mechanism is therefore not simply that one professional failed to listen to one victim, but that a whole sociocultural and institutional environment turns an initial interpretation into an apparently objective reality, protects it from contradiction, converts the consequences of its own interventions into supporting evidence, progressively removes the victim's independent sources of protection, and ultimately makes the person subjected to the system responsible for disproving the system that has already defined them. The problem is systemic and sociocultural rather than reducible to a collection of bad individuals, because human beings learn within institutions, acquire cognitive habits, absorb professional hierarchies, conform to prevailing explanations, and routinely attribute greater authority to people who occupy recognized positions. Confirmation bias, authority bias, group conformity, and institutional incentives that make inherited narratives difficult to question. So people can reproduce harmful mechanisms without ever having been taught to recognize them as harmful, while those with more power are repeatedly given the benefit of the doubt, and those with less power are required to prove themselves under conditions that make proof extraordinarily difficult. This is where scientific parsimony matters. When violence, deprivation, racism, family abuse, exploitation, institutional abandonment, social exclusion, or chronic insecurity are already demonstrable, they belong at the center of causal investigation rather than being displaced by increasingly remote explanations of what is supposedly wrong inside the individual. Many medical practitioners are not trained as scientists or researchers in the sense required to critically examine the evidentiary foundations of the frameworks they inherit, while scientists themselves also bear responsibility when they fail to investigate obvious competing explanations or allow contested models to acquire the status of settled knowledge. The distinction between clinical authority and scientific competence is therefore essential, because being a doctor, psychiatrist, psychologist, administrator, or other recognized professional establishes a social position and a set of responsibilities, but it does not itself establish that every interpretation made from that position is scientifically sound. Clinical experience matters enormously, but so do methodological rigor, critical reasoning, awareness of cognitive bias, examination of competing hypotheses, and willingness to revise an established interpretation when evidence contradicts it. Both biological and social scientists, together with researchers and practitioners across the relevant disciplines, therefore have a responsibility to work together rather than defend disciplinary territories, institutional interests, and inherited hierarchies of expertise, because the aim should be to understand human suffering rather than protect the boundaries of the people studying it. A genuinely rigorous approach requires mixed methods and open, honest science, bringing biological, clinical, psychological, ethnographic, and sociocultural evidence together, testing competing explanations rather than protecting established ones, working upwards from people's actual needs, and listening seriously to victims, whose lived experience is not an anecdotal inconvenience outside the scientific frame, but evidence about how the system actually operates. My own path into this question was formed through a long progression rather than a collection of disconnected interests, beginning with biology and neuroscience, continuing into evolutionary and biological anthropology and psychiatric genetics, and then extending into medical anthropology, collective mental health, and ethnopsychiatry, where I could examine how biomedical explanations operate once they encounter actual people, families, communities, and institutions. Before my doctoral research, I had already worked within biomedical research environments studying psychiatric questions, which gave me an understanding of those frameworks from within, while my subsequent anthropological training gave me the tools to investigate what they leave unexplained when detached from people's histories, relationships, material circumstances, and relations of power. I then spent 6 years undertaking fieldwork in Spain, Sweden, Italy, and Indonesia, not moving between countries simply to collect comparisons, but following a research question into different sociocultural and institutional environments and immersing myself in the lived reality of those affected. Because understanding mental suffering requires attention not only to the individual but also to families, communities, institutions, historical circumstances, economic conditions, and systems of authority. In Spain, I encountered a particularly harsh and fragmented form of social violence, in which institutions place extraordinary reliance on the family as an assumed source of protection, credibility, and knowledge, without adequately accounting for the fact that families are also a major setting for violence, coercive control, exploitation, and serious crimes committed by those closest to the victim, when relatives are themselves responsible for abuse. Institutional reliance on the family places those being harmed in an almost impossible position, because those causing the harm gain privileged access to the institutions deciding what is true about their victim, while attempts by the victim to contradict the established account are interpreted through that same account. In Sweden, I encountered racism and cruelty through a different institutional configuration, embedded within administrative procedures, professional language and social routines that present themselves as rational, efficient, and humane while producing profoundly destructive consequences, particularly for foreign people whose lives can be reduced to administrative problems to be managed rather than human realities requiring protection, due process, and accountability. The difficulty of confronting this form of violence lies partly in the fact that those participating in it may understand themselves as simply performing rational procedures, and therefore fail to recognize the cruelty contained in what they are doing, while the system itself provides the language through which that cruelty is presented as necessary, efficient, or reasonable. Italy provided an important positive historical reference through the democratic psychiatry developed in Trieste rather than through Italy as a whole, and its importance lies partly in the historical context in which it emerged, in a Europe still carrying the consequences of a world war, the Holocaust and the systematic destruction of people classified as mentally ill, disabled, deviant, politically inconvenient, racially or ethnically inferior, dissident or otherwise incompatible with totalitarian control. Against that history, Trieste demonstrated that psychiatry could move in another direction, with community, participation, and rights replacing institutional segregation and confinement, and its importance today lies precisely in showing that this was not an abstract ideal but something implemented in practice, even if much of that achievement now survives more as a fading institutional memory than as the dominant reality. Indonesia brought another dimension of the same problem into particularly stark view, because my fieldwork exposed the historical and contemporary consequences of colonial domination, authoritarian rule, and profound inequality together with the ways these histories continue to shape everyday relations of power. I encountered situations in which people's lives were subjected to extraordinary control by relatives, communities, and local authorities, with those people confined within their own homes, physically restrained, deprived of movement, separated from education and work, excluded from ordinary social participation, and made dependent upon those controlling them. What became particularly visible there was how social control becomes intimate when another person's freedom is treated as something that relatives, communities, or local authorities may legitimately remove, and how extreme inequality allows conditions approaching complete dependency and even forms of enslavement to become normalized around those already marked as different, disruptive, dangerous, or incapable of deciding for themselves. Historical domination and contemporary poverty are part of that context, but the mechanism operates through ordinary relationships as well as formal institutions, and brutality becomes normalized when the surrounding society accepts that another person's freedom and participation may be sacrificed for the convenience, security, authority, or gratification of those who control them. Across these settings, the economic and social dimensions of exploitation were impossible to ignore, because control over another person's money, property, labor, relationships, sexuality, social position, and access to opportunities produces concrete benefits for those exercising that control, while domination itself may become intertwined with the gratification of having another person dependent, frightened, humiliated, or unable to escape. Those benefiting from the arrangement can then present themselves as moral and superior precisely because the person beneath them has already been deprived of the conditions through which their capacities and humanity would otherwise remain visible. So the deprivation itself becomes evidence used to justify further deprivation. This is one of the most powerful mechanisms of exclusion, because the person who has been isolated is described as socially incapable, the person whose education has been destroyed as unproductive, the person weakened by abuse or treatment as incapable, the person made dependent as inherently dependent, and the person whose voice has been systematically discredited as unreliable. So the consequences imposed upon those people are transformed into supposed properties of those people themselves. The history behind this is not confined to psychiatry, because modern mental health systems emerged within societies that had long developed ways of classifying people as dangerous, deviant, inferior, burdensome, unproductive, or inconvenient, and then constructing institutional means of segregating, controlling, and excluding them. The 20th century demonstrated with catastrophic clarity what happens when medical authority, state power, scientific classification, and social prejudice converge around the idea that some lives possess less value. And although contemporary psychiatric systems must not simply be equated with those historical regimes, the historical continuity of classification, institutional authority, and coercive control remains essential to understanding how vulnerable populations become exposed to extraordinary powers over their bodies, freedom, and credibility. The people subjected to the most severe consequences are not distributed randomly across society. Target populations are disproportionately affected, including women, racialized minorities, migrants, impoverished communities, disabled people, children exposed to abusive adults, older people dependent upon institutional care, and others whose lives already place them at disadvantage before entering a mental health service. If the same populations repeatedly encounter greater exposure to coercion, exclusion, disbelief, and destructive responses, scientific inquiry must investigate the social conditions producing that disproportion rather than treating it as incidental. That is also why biological and genetic explanations need to be placed within, rather than above, the wider causal investigation, because biological research can contribute important knowledge, but genes do not describe violence, humiliation, poverty, discrimination, social exclusion, family dynamics, institutional abandonment, or chronic insecurity, when those exposures are already present. A scientifically parsimonious explanation must investigate them before attributing the resulting suffering primarily to an intrinsic defect within the individual. The failure damages medicine and science themselves, because when people subjected to abuse are mixed with patients whose primary needs genuinely require medical intervention, while the circumstances producing their distress remain inadequately investigated, both groups suffer. Those subjected to violence may receive interventions that do not address what is happening to them, while people who genuinely need medical care remain within systems that are already failing to provide adequate support to enormous numbers of patients. Who reports that substantial proportions of people with mental health conditions receive no adequate care, while coercive practices including involuntary treatment, seclusion, and restraint remain widely used internationally. So the problem is not simply excessive treatment, but a profoundly uneven system in which some people are subjected to coercion, while many others receive too little meaningful support. The tragedy is therefore not that medicine exists, nor that medication exists, because medicines have legitimate uses and help many people, but that care is so often organized around the management of the person rather than the restoration of their life, particularly when the principal circumstances requiring attention are violence, exploitation, trauma, social abandonment, or the absence of safety. In those situations, treatment that does not address the circumstances producing suffering leaves the central problem untouched, while the person may become increasingly isolated, dependent, and defined by the psychiatric narrative through which they entered the system. This contradiction is especially important for young people, because a first psychiatric crisis occurs at precisely the stage when education, work, relationships, independence, and identity are developing. And although the crisis itself does not determine the future, the response can rapidly organize that future around an expectation of chronic illness. Education is interrupted, relationships weaken, employment becomes harder to obtain, opportunities disappear, and the person begins to live within an environment where everyone around them has been taught to expect diminished capacity. Isolation intensifies the process, because removing someone from education, employment, friendships, family, community, and ordinary responsibilities removes many of the environments in which capacities are exercised and rebuilt. So a person who is separated from life does not simply wait unchanged for recovery. Their world becomes smaller, opportunities diminish, relationships weaken, and dependence increases, after which those losses can themselves be interpreted as evidence of permanent incapacity. This is how chronicity becomes more than a clinical description. It becomes a social trajectory produced through diagnosis, isolation, lowered expectations, loss of opportunity, and prolonged dependency. A period of crisis becomes an identity. The identity becomes a prognosis, and the prognosis becomes a restriction on the person's actual life. Where recovery is possible, that trajectory should be reversed, not because chronic illness does not exist or because everyone will recover in the same way, but because persistence must never become a predetermined social destiny. The objective of care should be to protect and maximize whatever possibility of recovery exists, evaluating success not merely according to whether a person becomes easier to manage, but according to whether they regain strength, relationships, education, work, participation, autonomy, and the capacity to imagine a future. My own history makes this distinction more than theoretical. My uncle and my aunt were diagnosed with schizophrenia when I was a small child. They were both very young, and I grew up watching two people I loved experience severe mental distress while their lives progressively contracted through isolation, electroshock treatment, heavy medication, friendships that disappeared, work and opportunities lost, and possibilities that might otherwise have been theirs. Later, I was diagnosed myself within the same deeply dysfunctional and abusive family environment, where psychiatric language was also used to control and discredit family members, and my own experience subsequently became much more severe, involving serious abuse, trauma, disability, physical consequences of psychiatric treatment, economic destruction, and institutional discrediting. By the beginning of my doctoral work, I was struggling with severe extrapyramidal symptoms and tremors and could barely speak, and deprescribing with the help of mental health professionals who recognized the harm being done became an important part of recovering my life. I did not encounter these experiences first and then construct an academic interest around them afterwards, because my scientific formation had already taken me through biology, neuroscience, psychiatric genetics, and anthropology before my doctoral research brought me into sustained medical anthropological fieldwork, and I subsequently investigated the mechanisms I had experienced from within several complementary scientific traditions. I therefore worked through the pain while acquiring the tools to analyze it, and the research became a way of understanding not only what had happened to me, but why similar mechanisms repeatedly appear in the lives of people with less power to resist them. Education and scientific work became a route towards independence, competence, legitimacy, and safety when many other routes had been closed, and completing my doctoral research did not erase what had happened to me, but it gave me the scientific training, fieldwork experience, and institutional position required to investigate it, and to understand that my experience belonged to a much larger sociocultural reality. That is why the lived history is not an appendix to this research. It is part of the reason the research exists, while at the same time the research cannot be reduced to my biography. Because the fieldwork extends across different societies, the analysis draws upon multiple scientific traditions, and the patterns I encountered repeatedly exceeded my own experience. The consequences of this system are not confined to those who survive it. Some people die by suicide. Some die prematurely after years of violence, deprivation, isolation, and institutional failure, and many survive with permanent physical and psychological consequences, together with economic destruction, damaged relationships, and years of life that cannot be recovered. These deaths cannot be understood adequately by reducing them to isolated clinical outcomes when the social and institutional circumstances surrounding them have never been properly investigated. Because the relevant question is not simply why a person died, but what happened to that person's life before death became the final entry in a record. This is particularly important for young people, because the first severe psychiatric crisis often occurs at a stage when education, work, relationships, independence, and identity are still being formed, and the response to that crisis can rapidly organize the rest of a person's life around an expectation of chronic illness. A young adult may enter the system with an acute crisis and leave it with a disrupted education, lost employment, damaged relationships, diminished physical strength, reduced confidence, social isolation, and a new identity as someone whose future is supposedly limited by permanent illness. The crisis itself does not determine that future, but the social response to it can profoundly reshape the conditions under which recovery would otherwise occur. This is why the consequences of psychiatric intervention must be distinguished carefully from the consequences of the underlying condition, because a person experiencing severe mental distress is not simply experiencing symptoms in isolation, they are also living through the effects of what happens around them. Isolation removes ordinary opportunities for participation. Coercion can destroy trust. Treatment effects can reduce physical and cognitive capacity. Disrupted education can close future opportunities. Unemployment can produce economic dependence. And the repeated message that recovery is unlikely can become part of the person's social environment. These consequences then appear in the clinical record as evidence of continuing illness, even when part of the deterioration has been produced or intensified by the response itself. The same problem affects older people, particularly those living in residential settings where dependency is already profound and the ability to contest decisions is reduced. Medication and other interventions may be imposed in circumstances where the person has limited capacity to challenge what is being done, while families, carers, and institutions may become deeply involved in decisions that affect the person's autonomy, bodily integrity, and daily life. Some families actively request intervention, others are pressured into accepting institutional decisions, and others may themselves benefit materially or socially from the person's dependency, which makes the assumption that family involvement is automatically protective fundamentally unsafe. The ethical problem becomes still greater when medication is used primarily to make a person easier to manage rather than to address a clearly established medical need, particularly when the person is already vulnerable because of age, disability, dependence, or cognitive impairment. The consequences are not merely pharmacological, because a person who becomes physically weaker, less alert, or less capable of communicating may also become less able to resist exploitation, report abuse, maintain relationships, or participate in decisions concerning their own life. The intervention can therefore alter the very capacities through which the person's autonomy and protection are supposed to be maintained. This does not mean that medication is inherently harmful or that pharmacological treatment has no legitimate place, because medicines can be necessary and beneficial. But the scientific and ethical question must always be what the treatment is intended to achieve, what evidence supports it, what alternatives have been considered, what burdens it imposes, and whether the person's life is actually becoming safer, more autonomous, and more functional as a result. A system that settles by default for indefinite maintenance, without pursuing recovery, wherever recovery remains possible, confuses management with care. That distinction matters particularly for people whose distress is rooted in violence, exploitation, or social abandonment, because medication alone does not remove an abusive family member. restore a destroyed livelihood, return an interrupted education, repair a damaged relationship, provide safe housing, or reverse institutional discrediting. When the surrounding conditions remain unchanged, the person may continue to suffer while becoming increasingly defined by the treatment itself, and the failure to address the underlying circumstances is then interpreted as evidence that the condition is intrinsically chronic. The same logic operates in childhood, where increasing medicalization of distress raises particularly serious questions because children have limited control over the environments in which they live and are often entirely dependent upon adults for protection, interpretation, and access to services. A child exposed to abuse, family conflict, deprivation, instability, or coercive control may express distress through behavior that adults find difficult to manage. And the temptation to treat the behavior as a property of the child rather than investigate the environment around them places the burden on precisely the person with the least power to change that environment. When the adults responsible for child are also the source of harm, the problem becomes structurally similar to what happens elsewhere in the system. The people with authority over the victim are simultaneously providing information to the institutions supposed to protect them, while the child's ability to produce an independent account is limited. A psychiatric or behavioral interpretation can then become a substitute for investigating what is happening in the child's life. And the child may grow into an identity constructed around pathology rather than one grounded in protection, development, and opportunity. These mechanisms are not simply medical problems, because they involve families, schools, social services, legal institutions, residential facilities, welfare systems, employers, police, researchers, and wider communities. Every category assigned to a person affects what others expect from them. Every expectation influences what opportunities remain available, and every lost opportunity can subsequently be interpreted as confirmation that the original category was correct. This is why the problem extends beyond individual psychiatric practice into the wider architecture of social protection. If a person reports abuse and the family account is automatically privileged, if a medical record is treated as more credible than the person's testimony without independent examination, if a complaint is returned to the institution being challenged, if professional authority is treated as evidence of correctness, and if the consequences of institutional intervention are later interpreted as proof that intervention was necessary, the system has lost the capacity to correct itself. The flaw is therefore enormous because it concerns not one intervention but the distribution of credibility and authority throughout the entire chain of protection. It affects how people enter systems, how their histories are recorded, how their behavior is interpreted, how complaints are processed, how professionals inherit information, how families are treated as evidence, how coercion is justified, how institutional responsibility is assigned, and how a person's future is determined after a psychiatric label has been attached to their life. What makes the failure particularly alarming is how blatant its consequences can become while the underlying mechanism remains largely invisible. A person reports abuse and is discredited, becomes distressed under coercion and has that distress interpreted as evidence of illness, loses relationships and is then described as socially dysfunctional, becomes economically dependent, and is then described as incapable of independence, protests against an institutional decision and is then described as lacking insight, while those responsible continue to occupy positions of authority. Each stage appears individually defensible when considered through the narrative inherited from the previous stage, yet the cumulative result can be the destruction of a human life. The system therefore creates a profound epistemic asymmetry. Those subjected to it are required to prove their account against records that already contradict them, while those who produce the records are not required to demonstrate the same degree of independent verification. The victim's account begins at a disadvantage because the institution has already produced an alternative account, and every subsequent attempt to correct it has to overcome not only the original interpretation, but the accumulated authority of everything that has been written since. This is why the psychiatric record matters so much, because a record is not merely a neutral container of facts, it is also a history of observations, interpretations, allegations, decisions, and inherited assumptions. When those elements are not clearly distinguished, an allegation can acquire the appearance of fact, an interpretation can acquire the appearance of observation, and a previous decision can acquire the appearance of independent evidence. Once repeated often enough, the resulting narrative appears corroborated simply because multiple people have encountered and reproduced it. The mechanism becomes particularly dangerous when the person challenges that record, because contradiction is then interpreted within the same framework that created the record. Someone saying that the account is wrong is treated as evidence of poor insight. Someone refusing to accept an inaccurate diagnosis is treated as demonstrating denial. Someone becoming angry about an injustice is treated as demonstrating instability. And someone continuing to seek accountability is treated as demonstrating pathological preoccupation. The person is therefore placed in a position where almost every possible response confirms the interpretation already made about them. This is one reason why coercion is so destructive, because coercion does not merely impose an intervention on the body, it changes the relationship between the person and the institution, and often between the person and everyone around them. Trust is replaced by fear, participation by compliance, dialogue by authority, and the person's account of what is happening becomes increasingly difficult to separate from the consequences of being controlled. If the person later reacts with anger, mistrust, or withdrawal, those reactions are then interpreted without sufficient attention to the coercive circumstances that produced them. The same circularity affects the people providing care, because professionals operating within a coercive framework may come to understand resistance as evidence that the framework is necessary, while the framework itself creates the resistance that appears to justify it. The professional then experiences the person's reaction as confirmation. The person experiences the professional's interpretation as further evidence that they are not being heard. And both sides become locked into positions that become increasingly difficult to reverse. The institutional structure can also become protective of itself because acknowledging a serious complaint may have consequences beyond the individual professional. It may require the institution to review procedures, question previous decisions, reconsider the reliability of records, acknowledge failures affecting other people, and accept responsibility for harm. When many victims have already passed through the same environment, a credible complaint can therefore threaten an entire accumulated history rather than one isolated decision. This is where the distinction between individual perpetrators and systemic conditions becomes essential. Some professionals participate actively in abuse, some enable it through negligence or indifference, some reproduce harmful assumptions without examining them, and some genuinely attempt to protect people within systems that make protection difficult. Likewise, abuse outside professional settings may be perpetrated by relatives, partners, carers, community members, or other people who discover that institutional narratives can be used to discredit the person they are harming. The existence of systemic protection does not make every professional a perpetrator, but it creates conditions in which perpetrators can remain protected and victims can remain exposed. The same applies to people who deliberately seek positions or environments in which they can exercise power over others, because professional status and institutional access can provide opportunities for exploitation when oversight is weak. A person intent on abusing others does not need to control the entire institution, they only need the surrounding system to make their victims less credible than themselves. Once that condition exists, authority becomes a resource that can be used against the person who is trying to report what happened. This is why professional status must never be confused with moral or scientific reliability, and why safeguards must apply precisely where authority is greatest. The person who holds a recognized position should carry a greater burden of accountability, not a permanent presumption of correctness, because the consequences of an error are greatest when the person making the decision possesses the power to impose it. The broader historical context matters because these mechanisms develop within societies that repeatedly use classification as a means of deciding who belonged and who did not. Women, racialized minorities, migrants, disabled people, impoverished communities, children, dissidents, and people considered sexually, socially, or politically deviant have all been subjected at different times to forms of classification and control that presented exclusion as protection, discipline as treatment, and domination as social order. The 20th century demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of this convergence when medical authority, scientific classification, state bureaucracy, and racist ideology were mobilized to identify lives considered inferior, burdensome, or unworthy of preservation, culminating in mass sterilization, institutional killing, and extermination. The extermination of people classified as mentally ill and disabled under National Socialism was not an inexplicable event outside the history of medicine. It emerged from a much older intellectual and institutional environment in which some lives had already been classified as defective and therefore available for coercion, segregation, and destruction. The lesson is not that contemporary mental health care is equivalent to those historical regimes, because such an equation would obscure rather than clarify the differences, but that the power to classify human beings must never be treated as morally neutral simply because contemporary institutions use more humane language. The historical memory matters precisely because systems of classification can acquire enormous authority, while the people being classified lose the ability to challenge them. The language has changed, but the danger remains whenever protection becomes indistinguishable from control, whenever care becomes a justification for overriding autonomy without adequate scrutiny, whenever social difference becomes evidence of pathology, and whenever a person's diminished status is used to justify further restrictions on their life. This is why target populations matter so strongly in the research, because disproportionate exposure is evidence that something about the social environment is contributing to the distribution of harm. If women, racialized minorities, migrants, impoverished communities, disabled people, children exposed to abusive adults, and other marginalized populations repeatedly encounter greater levels of coercion, exclusion, and disbelief, the explanation cannot reasonably stop at the characteristics of those populations themselves. Their position within society, their exposure to violence and deprivation, their access to resources, and their relationship with institutions must form part of the causal model. The same principle applies to the continuing search for increasingly remote biological explanations when immediate social causes are already present. Genetics and neuroscience are scientifically valuable fields, but their findings must be interpreted within the full causal environment of human lives. Genes do not record violence, poverty, racism, humiliation, family exploitation, institutional abandonment, insecurity, or exclusion. And a biological association does not explain why one person was exposed to a particular environment, how that environment affected them, or what should be done to change it. Scientific parsimony therefore requires asking which explanation accounts for the greatest amount of evidence with the fewest unsupported assumptions, not because simple explanations are automatically correct, but because unnecessary complexity should not displace causes that are already observable and demonstrable. When a person has experienced sustained violence, deprivation, exploitation, discrimination, and institutional abandonment, those exposures must be investigated before researchers construct increasingly elaborate explanations centered on an intrinsic defect in the individual. This responsibility belongs to science as a whole, not merely to practitioners, because researchers have repeatedly failed to give sufficient scientific weight to the social, historical, and material conditions under which psychiatric categories are produced and applied. Biological and social scientists, clinicians, anthropologists, psychologists, historians, epidemiologists, legal scholars, economists, and other disciplines need to work together instead of defending disciplinary territories and vested interests, because the object of inquiry is one human life and its surrounding environment, not a collection of disconnected academic domains. A genuinely rigorous program therefore requires mixed methods, open and honest science, transparent reasoning, independent scrutiny, attention to cognitive bias, and serious incorporation of lived experience. It requires working upwards from people's actual needs, asking what has happened to them, what conditions surround them, what interventions have helped or harmed, what alternatives exist, and what evidence supports each explanation, rather than beginning from an established category and fitting the person into it. The goal is not to replace science with testimony, but to make science more complete by incorporating evidence that conventional systems have systematically excluded. Nor is the goal to reject clinical expertise, but to distinguish expertise from unquestionable authority, and to ensure that professional judgment remains accountable to evidence, human rights, and the person whose life is being affected. This matters because the consequences of getting the framework wrong are not abstract. They affect whether a person is believed, whether abuse is investigated, whether coercion is imposed, whether relationships survive, whether education continues, whether employment remains possible, whether a person retains control over their resources, whether they can participate in society, and whether they retain a future beyond the identity assigned to them. The economic consequences alone can be devastating, because years of treatment, interrupted education, unemployment, dependency, loss of housing, damaged careers, and family conflict can remove the material foundations required for recovery. The person may then be judged according to the consequences of those losses, creating another circular process in which poverty becomes evidence of incapacity. Dependency becomes evidence of chronicity, and social exclusion becomes evidence of social dysfunction. There's also a dimension of exploitation that cannot be ignored, because power over another person's life creates opportunities for economic, social, and sexual benefit. People who control housing, finances, employment, care, medication, access to institutions, or social relationships possess resources that can be used either to protect or to exploit. And when the victim's credibility has already been damaged, exploitation becomes harder to report and easier to rationalize. The social environment may then benefit from the person's exclusion while presenting itself as morally superior to them, because once someone has been isolated, deprived, and discredited, their resulting condition appears to confirm the negative image imposed upon them. They are treated as the source of the problem when much of what society sees has been produced by the conditions imposed upon them. And those who participate in the process can experience themselves as responsible, rational, or even compassionate, while contributing to the person's destruction. That is the deeper sociocultural mechanism I encountered across my fieldwork, the production of a person who appears to justify the treatment imposed upon them. The person is made dependent and then described as dependent, isolated and then described as socially incapable, frightened and then described as unstable, weakened and then described as lacking capacity, discredited and then described as unreliable, excluded and then described as unable to participate. The consequences of social and institutional action are converted into evidence about the nature of the person, and the resulting representation becomes increasingly difficult to challenge. This is why the victim is often left completely defenseless, because the process removes not only credibility but the practical means through which credibility could be restored. The family may have been captured by the narrative, friends may have withdrawn, professionals may rely upon the record, institutions may defer to one another, financial resources may have disappeared, physical and cognitive capacity may have deteriorated, and the person may be too exhausted or frightened to continue challenging a system that appears to have unlimited resources compared with their own. There may be formal complaint procedures, but formal existence is not equivalent to meaningful access to justice. A complaint mechanism that returns the person to the institution being challenged, a review that begins from the records produced by that institution, or an assessment conducted by professionals who already accept the established narrative does not provide genuine independence. The victim needs an external route capable of examining both the person's account and the institutional account, without presuming in advance that either is correct. Without that independence, the system becomes a closed circuit. The institution defines the person, the definition determines the intervention produces consequences, the consequences reinforce the definition, the records document the consequences, subsequent professionals trust the records, and the complaint is assessed through the resulting narrative. The person is then asked to disprove a structure that has been generating evidence for itself throughout the entire process. This is the profound injustice at the center of the research. Those subjected to abuse are required to demonstrate an almost impossible degree of consistency and innocence under conditions that systematically undermine both, while those with power are permitted extraordinary latitude to cause harm and remain credible. The problem is not merely that some people fall through the gaps of an otherwise protective system, because the gaps themselves become part of the mechanism through which protection is denied. The scale of this failure is enormous, yet it remains widely ignored because the people most affected are often the least credible people within the institutional framework supposed to hear them. Their accounts are fragmented, medicalized, and repeatedly displaced by the records written about them, while the people responsible for constructing those records retain the authority to define what happened. Making the mechanism visible is therefore a necessary scientific and social task, because awareness is the first condition for scrutiny, and scrutiny is the condition for accountability. The purpose of this work is not to generate another accusation without remedy, but to understand precisely how these failures are produced and to identify the institutional, scientific, and social conditions required to prevent them. The positive direction is already visible in the principles increasingly reclaimed by major international organizations and movements in mental health: person-centered care, recovery-oriented practice, trauma-informed approaches, community-based support, participation, autonomy, human rights, and the reduction or elimination of coercion. These approaches do not require abandoning medicine or scientific knowledge. They require placing both within a broader understanding of human beings in which history, relationships, context, trauma, bodily integrity, social conditions, and lived experience remain part of the reality being treated. Recovery must therefore become an actual objective rather than a rhetorical aspiration, not because every person will recover in the same way or because chronic conditions do not exist, but because the existence of chronic illness must never become a reason to stop looking for every realistic avenue towards greater autonomy, participation, and quality of life. Care should ask what would allow this person to regain strength, relationships, education, work, safety, meaning, and control over their own future, and should direct resources towards those conditions whenever they are achievable. This is especially important for people whose lives have been damaged by the system itself, because telling someone to recover while continuing to isolate them, remove their opportunities, undermine their credibility, and define their future through chronicity is internally contradictory. Recovery requires conditions in which recovery can actually occur. My own experience demonstrated this because scientific education and research became part of the process through which I rebuilt capacities that had been treated as lost. And the ability to study, conduct fieldwork, teach, and contribute scientifically was not simply a career development, but a recovery of participation, autonomy, and future. It showed me directly why the objective of care must never be reduced to keeping someone manageable, when there remains a possibility of helping them rebuild a meaningful life. That experience also changed the meaning of scientific work for me, because research became not an escape from lived reality, but a way of investigating it with greater precision. Fieldwork allowed me to encounter people whose lives were being shaped by the same broad mechanisms under very different historical and institutional conditions, while anthropology provided methods for understanding what statistical categories and clinical records often fail to capture. The relationships, meanings, histories, conflicts, and power structures through which suffering is produced and interpreted. The book is therefore the continuation of that work, bringing the scientific evidence, historical analysis, fieldwork, and lived experience together in a form accessible beyond academia, while creating a basis for further research, public discussion, and collaboration. The purpose is to make the mechanisms visible enough that they can be questioned, investigated, and ultimately changed. Invisible Lives Taken Down is not an argument that suffering is imaginary, nor that psychiatric illness does not exist, nor that medication has no legitimate place, and it is not an accusation against every professional who works in mental health. It is an argument for more rigorous understanding of causality, a stronger protection of people subjected to institutional power, a more honest science, and a form of care whose success is measured by what happens to human lives rather than by how successfully those lives can be managed. The people whose lives have been reduced to diagnosis deserve to have their histories taken seriously. Those subjected to violence deserve investigation and protection rather than further discrediting. Patients who genuinely need medical care deserve systems capable of distinguishing illness from the consequences of abuse. Children and older people whose decisions depend upon others deserve particularly strong safeguards. Professionals deserve scientific systems that allow them to question inherited narratives rather than simply reproduce them. And society deserves institutions in which care does not become another name for control. The deaths, lost years, destroyed relationships, interrupted education, lost careers, and diminished futures are not acceptable collateral consequences of a system that claims to protect human beings. Nor should people have to destroy themselves proving that they were harmed before anyone considers whether the machinery surrounding them might have been wrong. The central question is therefore not whether we can make the existing system slightly more efficient, but whether we are willing to examine the assumptions on which it operates, the distribution of authority it protects, the populations it repeatedly fails, the mechanisms through which its own errors become self-validating, and the enormous human cost of leaving those mechanisms unchallenged. That is why this research needs to continue and why the book needs to exist. The work is intended to document what is happening, analyze why it persists, connect lived experience with scientific evidence, bring different disciplines into the same investigation, and contribute to the practical knowledge required to build systems in which people are protected rather than progressively stripped of the means to protect themselves. Supporting the project therefore supports more than a publication. It supports continued research, fieldwork, analysis, scientific communication, and the effort to bring a neglected reality into public view. Buying the book helps make the findings accessible, while supporting the research allows the investigation itself to continue. There is an enormous amount still to understand, but the direction is clear. Listen to those affected. Investigate the circumstances surrounding suffering, scrutinize authority, distinguish evidence from inherited narrative, account for cognitive bias, bring biological and social explanations together, protect complainants independently, reduce coercion, pursue recovery, and measure success by whether human beings regain the greatest possible control over their own lives. Mental health must never become a place where further cruelty is excused because it is called treatment, where isolation is mistaken for protection, where dependence is mistaken for chronicity, where a complaint becomes evidence against the person making it, or where institutional convenience is allowed to outweigh the life of the person entrusted to the system. It must become a field in which science is genuinely open to correction, professional authority is genuinely accountable, lived experience is genuinely heard, and every realistic opportunity for recovery is pursued with the same seriousness that institutions have historically devoted to control. That is the work I am asking you to help continue.